Okay, good morning to those of you in the auditorium at AAAS, and to those of you attending from around the world, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, as appropriate to your location. We're so excited to be able to speak with all of you at this really awesome conference, the 2022 AAAS Science, Technology, and Human Rights Conference, and we look forward to participating with you over the next few days in this informative and uplifting program. We want to express our appreciation to Teresa Harris, Nate Weisenberg, and all of those who have organized this conference, and to the members of the Human Rights Coalition and AAAS for sponsoring this really important event that we're so humbled to be a part of. Also, thank you to Dorothy Phillips and members of the ACS panel this morning for their moving and eye-opening presentation. My name is Neil Rubin, and I am speaking to you from Chicago, Illinois, where we acknowledge and respect our place in the ancestral lands of the Council of Three Fires, which dates back to the year 796 and consists of the Ojibwa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi peoples. I am a professor here at Ottawa University, and I previously served as chair of the Committee on Scientific Freedom and Responsibility in the Scientific Responsibility, Human Rights, and Law program at AAAS. I'm also co-author of the Cambridge Handbook of Psychology and Human Rights. We have titled our program An Inclusive Perspective on the Training of Future Scientists. The perspectives we will be sharing with you are aligned with the conference theme, the human right to science. We share the view that in order for us to promote the human right to science, education in human rights must be at the foundation of our efforts. We understand our human rights to be entitlements. We are entitled to these human rights simply by virtue of having been born. These human rights are inalienable and indivisible. Compromise of any one right compromises all our rights. These rights belong to all persons and all peoples, everyone, everywhere, no exceptions. AAAS has participated in the movement to develop our understanding and to promote the human right to science, as first documented in Article 15 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Among the statements in Article 15, as Dorothy Phillips mentioned earlier, is the guarantee that everyone has the right to benefit from scientific advancements. It further clarifies that scientists have rights too, both in terms of the freedom to pursue science, as well as the right of protections for their discoveries. Our program today takes the position that to further development and realization of this right, human rights education is essential in the education and training of future scientists, as well as broadening the appreciation of this right to civil society beyond academia. Why? In the modern world, we encounter the many wonders and advantages, as well as the challenges and fears associated with breakthroughs in science, artificial intelligence, and emerging technologies. We ask, will the transformations engendered by these advances ameliorate the challenges posed by society's inequities and inequalities, or will they replicate yesterday's injustices today and in the future? As psychologists, we are concerned that scientific advancement needs to be accompanied by an appreciation for the ethical and human rights implications of human progress. Human rights education across the sciences and among the general public has the promise of informing the opportunities that scientific progress provides if they are accompanied by informed guidance for the protections and guarantees of fundamental rights and human dignity. Therefore, to that end, our first panelist will describe the movement for international human rights education and a model developed for the education of psychologists. Our second panelist will detail a human rights educational program for undergraduates across disciplines to prepare students with a rights-based lens to enhance their awareness of our diverse world. And our third panelist will provide an illustrative case example of introducing human rights education beyond the traditional classroom, engaging students representing a marginalized community. And following these talks, of course, we look forward to a robust discussion with all of you. So, to begin, It is my honor to introduce these experts, beginning with Dr. Phyllis Tibbets, who is advancing human rights. She is UNESCO Chair in Human Rights and Higher Education and Chair in Human Rights Education at the Human Rights Center at Utrecht University in the Netherlands. She is also visiting professor at Nelson Mandela University in South Africa and lecturer in the Comparative and International Education program at Teachers College at Columbia University. In addition to Phyllis's scholarship, she has written practical resources on curriculum, program development, and evaluation on behalf of the Office of UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, UNICEF, UNESCO, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, the Council of Europe, and non-governmental organizations such as Amnesty International and the Open Society Foundation. Dr. Tibbets, you have the virtual floor. I'll get rid of my slides so you can get started.
Thank you, Dr. Rubin, and it's such a pleasure to be with you and my other colleagues on this panel. So as the introduction that Dr. Rubin gave for me suggests, I am quite invested in human rights education as a whole, and my presentation this morning will be focusing on, as Dr. Rubin mentioned, on the international human rights education movement. So I'm going to present briefly on that, and including some of the policies we now have from the United Nations, and then move into the implications for the field of psychology, which my other colleagues will be illustrating through their own practice in the classroom. So I want to confirm that everyone can see my slides.
Yes.
Great, thank you very much. So although we're focusing on the field of psychology in this particular panel, I just wanted to begin with a sort of visual image of the different settings in which human rights education is already taking place in non-formal education, in the schooling sector, also with professionals such as the military and police. It has a wide variety of practices now in terms of learner groups. There have been many developments in human rights education, certainly since I first became involved, which was in the early 1990s. You might remember there was a very historic events at that time. The Berlin Wall came down, apartheid ended, and the human rights movement as a whole was lifted up, and with that, human rights education. And these are some of the statistics that we can find in terms of the expansion of human rights as a theme in the presence of curriculum in organizations. And I won't read all of these to you, but the main point is that there's been a great deal of expansion up until the time we were collecting statistics on this, which is 2017. Similarly, we've also seen an evolution inside of the UN system in regards to the recognition of human rights education as intrinsic to the goals, the human rights goals of the United Nations and member states, we think, we hope. I wanted to point out when the United Nations was started, the kind of language we were seeing in reference to education was very, very general. So in the UN Charter and subsequent conventions, we saw language like education as strengthening respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, very, very general. But with the Declaration on the Rights of the Child, and then finally the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the UN put much more focus on what it means to have a right to education and what quality education would look like. So moving from accessibility to quality until this point now where we don't technically have a right to human rights education recognized by the United Nations and member states, but we have something very, very close. In a policy document, the Declaration on Human Rights Education and Training that came out in 2011, in that first article, which you can see, there was very direct language, which doesn't say that there's a right to human rights education, but it comes pretty darn close. Everyone has the right to know, seek, and receive information about all human rights and fundamental freedoms, and should have access to human rights education and training. So very clear. So very close. I think the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights is expecting that there might be a treaty on HRE in the future. They've already begun to compile excerpts from various international and regional human rights instruments that would validate that it is that there is there could be potentially a legal standard related to the delivery of human rights education. But in any case, we already have a strong signal to member states, duty bearers, that they should deliver it. I want to spend just a minute or two on the definition. I know it's a lot of text, but there's a lot in this definition that I think is very telling about what human rights education is all about. So this you'll find in the Declaration on Human Rights Education and Training. First of all, the United Nations recognizes that basically any kind of learning you can think of, formal to non-formal or even awareness raising, can fall in the basket of human rights education. And I also, stepping back, I want to point out, I'm using the term human rights education. The Declaration refers to human rights education and training, and that was because there was, among some member states at that time, a thinking that education meant schooling. And the Declaration wanted to be sure to send the signal that, in fact, human rights education was not just for kindergarten through 12th grade, but in fact for professional training, for non-formal education, and all these venues that are mentioned in this first part of this definition. So they put in training to emphasize that. Anyway, going back to aimed at observing or promoting universal respect for and observance of all human rights and fundamental freedoms, that's the language we've been seeing since the UN Charter. So it's just a kind of a refraction back on that language we've seen in other documents. And thus contributing to, inter alia, the prevention of human rights violations and abuses. And this is extremely important for human rights education. It's not just about getting content, learning knowledge, but being motivated, learners becoming motivated to care about human rights and to actively look to promote human rights, not only for themselves, but for others as well, and allyship. Very, very important. And then the last paragraph just acknowledges knowledge, skills, and understanding, attitudes as dimensions or domains, if you will, of human rights education, which is further addressed actually in this really very nice part of the Declaration, which you may have seen elsewhere, but I really like this. I think it puts in a nutshell what is the sort of the gold standard of human rights education, which is that on the one hand, of course, it has to deal with some content about human rights, some of the legal standards. I mean, how we get to that, how it's contextualized, that's a matter of pedagogy, but agreement that in order for it to be considered human rights education, there's got to be some treatment of the standards and not just general values, which might be very meaningful and human rights aligned, but not the full story of what the human rights framework offers. Education through human rights means that how we teach human rights, how people are learning human rights matters, that the culture of the learning environment, the experiential learner-centered pedagogy is very important and should be a consideration when developing human rights education programming. So people are learning through the values that are embodied in human rights. And finally, education for human rights, as you might imagine, meaning that human rights education and learning should be intrinsically assisting the international human rights movement, if you will, or the community movement. It should be making a difference in terms of people's interests, motivation, and capabilities to respect, protect, and promote human rights as the duty bearers need to. Another long list, I will not read this, but just to show you that there are now, especially since the 1990s, as you can see the dates here, increasing presence of human rights education in international and regional human rights education policies. UNESCO's recommendation, by the way, at the top here, 1974, is being revised. And just today, actually, I got an email with the revised version that's under consideration. So it's all to say that that's also being updated. Of course, human rights was there at the outset and will be there also in the new one, I expect. All these international policies basically address who is responsible for delivering human rights education, essentially duty bearers, and the sectors for which it's relevant, including both the formal and the non-formal education sectors. The aims of human rights education, already addressed in the definition. The policies also go into general principles of pedagogy, like it should be absolutely relevant to people's everyday lives, not just learning about human rights problems over there, but problems in our own communities, but also flipping that, thinking about the human rights values and standards as a kind of positive, as a vision for how we should behave and act with one another. So not just looking at the negatives, but also affirming the positives, and that the pedagogy should be learner-centered, participatory, empowering. I'm sure that the next two panelists will demonstrate how they're doing this in their own courses, and I'm really looking forward to hearing about that. These policies also suggest particular themes and learning outcomes, and something called the human rights-based approach, which moves us from beyond thinking just about teaching and learning processes to the institutions that are carrying out human rights education, thinking about them as having to reflect human rights values in their own ways of working. So I have about 5 minutes left, and I'd like to now switch a little bit to the links with psychology. So human rights education and training, first of all and foremost, can be seen as orienting scientists as duty bearers in fulfilling their responsibilities in a manner that's consistent with international and regional human rights standards and principles. This is the rights-based approach. So before we even get to what psychologists or prospective psychologists might learn in training, recognizing that they, as scientists, like other scientists, should fulfill their responsibilities in a manner that is consistent with human rights. They should not be personally, directly or indirectly responsible for human rights violations. At the same time, they are rights holders, as Dr. Ruman said, that their rights need to be protected in terms of their being able to fulfill their responsibilities. And also, I think rights holders here, another view of rights holders are if you're practicing psychologist clients or others affected by psychologists who should have access to the science, in this case of psychology, and also receive services in a way that are consistent, non-discriminatory, and consistent with human rights principles. The American Psychological Association, APA, has developed a 5 connections human rights framework, which is a wonderful example, I think, for all professional associations working with scientists. And I want to briefly present these and then wrap up with a few sort of pointers for adult learning in human rights education that I've learned over the years. So you can see here, this looks like a little flower, actually. It's 5 points basically on how the APA suggests that their members can think about human rights as relevant for their work. And again, I invite you, those of you who are not psychologists, to also think about relating this to your own work. So the first of all is this notion that the scientists, the psychologists themselves should enjoy their human rights. So this is the idea of psychologists, again, as rights holders, recognizing that psychologists possess human rights by virtue of being human, and that also they have rights that are very specific to the role they play and carrying out their responsibilities in their scientific field, in this case, psychology. Apply, the second point here, psychologists as duty bearers, that psychologists should apply their knowledge and methods for the greater realization of human rights, that these norms matter. So it's not just the ethical norms that the work of psychologists be carried out away in a manner that is non-discriminatory, for example, but moreover to think even wider and longer, that psychology should improve not only the well-being of individuals, but social justice in society, I would argue. Psychologists as duty bearers and human rights defenders, that they should be vigilant in terms of guarding against human rights violations in research and practice, not only theirs, but also their field as a whole. That's kind of a big task, but putting it out there. Advocate. Psychologists are also, can be seen in themselves as human rights defenders. So their psychologists, their associations can draw on distinct theoretical frameworks and applied knowledge to advocate for system level change. So this again is a kind of higher order in terms of the roles and responsibilities of psychologists and the sector, maybe something to discuss, but the APA human rights framework recognizes that advocacy is also a role for APA members. And finally, as psychologists, as duty bearers, again, not only ensuring that the work that's carried out is consistent with human rights, but ensuring that all people have equal access to basically the science that can be offered through psychologists. So in my last minute, a couple of tips that come from some of my experience in human rights education. This is going to be very familiar to those of you who've been doing human rights education, so bear with me. But first of all, very, very important that whatever learning we facilitate around human rights, that it's able to be related to people's daily lives. Not only their professional life, their life in this case as a psychologist, their roles as a psychologist, but also their personal lives. These are, of course, interlinked to some degree, relevant for their daily lives. And I found in working with professional groups, it's quite useful to see how the human rights framework, its values, the legal standards, can respond to genuine needs that people have, questions they have about practice that are not thoroughly answered, for example, maybe by their codes of conduct or ethical frameworks in their profession. Like in the Netherlands, I'm working with psychologists, and the burning question for some of them is, should I provide services to undocumented persons when the law prohibits this? On that note, as we think about competencies and learning programs for people who are in the profession, pre-service or in service, integrating human rights norms again into very, very specific roles and responsibilities. For example, working with clients, for example, working with the police, it's very specific to use of force and arrest procedures. We also need to think or remember, and I'm sure we all do, that when we think about human rights, it's such a wide frame in terms of its values and standards with such deep implications. We need to be thinking of that person as a whole human and thinking not just about their role as a professional, thinking about their own experiences, for example, potentially experiencing human rights violations or their experience as a human rights defender, if we're using those terms, but think of them as a whole person. There's some other standards here you can read for yourself. I think our other panelists will talk about peer exchange, critical reflection, experiential learning, and dealing with norms. I conclude by just saying that in the end, human rights education should engage the mind, heart, and hands. It's a very, very exciting and rewarding endeavor. And I now I'm looking forward to hearing the presentations of my colleagues on the work they're doing in higher education. Thanks for your attention.
And thank you, Felissa, for helping us see the big picture internationally, as well as your detailed comments, which touch on so many important things, including our responsibilities, if not obligations, to represent human rights in our conduct and our interaction and our teaching, and that it's important that we embody what we believe in what we do. So our next speaker I'm happy to introduce is Dr. Roseanne Flores. Dr. Flores is a professor in the Department of Psychology at Hunter College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, who has also recently received an advanced certificate in public administration and public policy, as well as a certificate in healthcare policy and administration, both from CUNY, the CUNY School of Professional Studies. She's also a faculty associate of the Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute at Hunter College, as well as a member of the Public Policy and Human Rights faculty there. She's a developmental psychologist who is the incoming president-elect for the Eastern Psychological Association. She is serving as American Psychological Representative to the United Nations. Her research focuses on the intersection between education, health disparities, and human rights. And she's the co-editor of the recently published award-winning Cambridge Handbook of Psychology and Human Rights. So, Roseanne, the virtual floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Neil, for the warm introduction. And it's a pleasure to follow behind Felicia. So I'm going to be talking about when psychological science and human rights meet in the classroom and preparing the next generation of psychologists and human rights scholars, but really focusing on undergraduate education. As Neil mentioned, I'm on the faculty, the Department of Psychology at Hunter, but also on the Human Rights faculty. And we have a human rights program here at Hunter as part of the Roosevelt House. And we also have a sort of rich history of human rights here with the work of Eleanor Roosevelt, right? And so I sort of really wanted to start with that frame before I tell you a little bit what we're going to do. All righty. So we're going to start by looking at undergraduate education, thinking about the complexity of student perspectives, and then talk a little bit about the framework that we can use for educating future generations. So a little bit of difference in thinking about this in terms of undergraduate education, particularly here at Hunter, and particularly at the programs I'm going to reference, were to look at what the human rights program would have to offer students, and then what our psychology majors would be getting when they take a course that integrates both perspectives. And so at the human rights side in the human rights program, the students would generally look at human rights law, theory and practice, human rights norms and public policy, focusing on international relations, and then some corporate behaviors. And in theory, look at lots of contemporary issues, things like climate change, perhaps the death penalty, health issues, health disparities, gender issues. And so those are some of the things that our students in the human rights program would take. And I should let you know that those students, human rights would not be their major. It would either be a certificate that they would be completing and or a minor that they would be engaging in. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. Our psychology undergraduate major, on the other hand, are psychology majors, right? And so they're going to think about using psychological sciences to address lots of different areas when they take a course on human rights. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. And so they'll look at some of those local and national issues that Felicia was talking about before, perhaps women's issues as they're integrated with women's rights. And so we might have a course, and we actually do have a course here on women in psychology, right? And so again, depending on what they're taking, they may look at that. They might think about children's rights and child development. So clearly, I'm a developmental psychologist. I teach child development, but in theory, we'd also integrate child rights into that. Climate change, if we're thinking about environmental psychology and we're teaching a course on environmental psychology or raising those issues, we might be thinking about cross-cultural psychology, and we have a course on cross-cultural psychology and how does that work with migration and immigration. And then, as Felicia just mentioned at the last time, also thinking about the ethics and social responsibility and how you get at that and looking at it in the context of a diverse world. So then we think about, well, how do you integrate all of that into one course? And so the course I'm actually going to use as the case study later on was a course that I developed, the psychology and human rights from social and developmental perspectives. And I'll go into that in a second. But at the first hand, when we think about it, again, going back to theory and practice, well, we know that we have lots of treaties and lots of documentation at the United Nations, some of the things that we talked about before. So we might be looking at racism and discrimination in psychology as it work at the United Nations. Perhaps it's poverty and well-being, okay? And that can cut across the lifespan from children's rights to aging, right? So we have that. We can think about the protections and the promotions of women's rights, past, present, and future. So we can think about things like CEDAW. We could think about children's rights, as Felicia just talked a little bit about before. Again, the rights of older persons. And then again, I think about, the psychology of science and the human genome in particular. And it's something that I actually teach in the course that I constructed and put together. So we focus a little bit on that as well. On the contemporary issues, and these are the things that will change and come up, we're thinking about the right to health and mental health. And this is particularly important, again, when I taught this class this semester, because we were just coming back out of the COVID pandemic. The first time I taught it, we were going into the pandemic, and now we're sort of in the middle of this pandemic. I'm coming out of it. But we thought about thinking about mental health and what those stresses look like. And we're doing it right now since we're online with you, and how that affected overall health. We also had to talk about migration and immigration, and we're all living through it right now. And we can think about migration from within the United States, if we think about it from across our own states within there, or we can think about it across globally, right? And I'll come back to that in a second, in terms of how I have the students think about things that occur locally, nationally, and internationally, and how sometimes they are the exact same things. So then we also talked about LGBTQI rights and the promotion and protection of the community. We thought about that again in the context of many things, particularly within the context of migration and immigration. And what does that look like for individuals across those contexts? And then human rights and technology. Again, do we have a right to technology? And that was something that came up again, and it was a stark contrast because of the pandemic. So while we were thinking about going online, well, some places couldn't go online. Some children didn't have access to school. They don't have access to computers. And again, you can think about this internationally. You can also think about it locally. So within the same United States that we're living in, some communities actually children had access to computers and can go to school, and others did not. So what does that look like? And then human trafficking, right? And a list of human trafficking. So those were some of the contemporary issues that we brought to bear. Let me talk a little bit about the complexity of working with students within two sort of different concentrations, right? So the purpose of the course that was constructed, particularly to focus on this integration, as I said, was psychology and human rights from a developmental and social perspectives, right? The goal was to examine the intersectionality between both of those disciplines, right? For most psychology majors, this is going to be their first understanding of human rights. Some students may have, when they were in high school, for example, right, participated in Model UN. But that's very rare, right? So for most often, as we're talking about human rights education and when you're exposed, most students wouldn't have been exposed. But clearly, they've been exposed to the underlying psychological science. And that can take many forms, right? So maybe it's neuroscience, maybe it's developmental, maybe it's environmental, cross cultural, clinical, mental health. So they clearly, and I should let you know, this is an upper level course, right? So clearly they've had a foundation in these areas, one of these areas in particular, but for the most part, a broad breadth of this. For the human rights student, however, they're coming from multiple disciplines. So they could be coming from political science, they could be coming from history, they could be doing anthropology, they could be doing biology and chemistry. They're coming from a range of different disciplines, but what they have is a grounding in human rights, right? So they have a grounding in the foundation of understanding human rights because they've been exposed to it in multiple courses across the line. But again, they have a limited understanding of psychological science and the role that psychological science might play in addressing some of these human rights norms and problems. And I say that because more often than not, most of our students will have had an introductory to psychology class, right? But that's it. They haven't had a breadth of understanding about what the field has to offer in addressing some of these programs. So now the course is made up of both sets of students. Right? The course has both sets of students, and each one of them has their strengths and each one of them has their weaknesses in both of these areas. Well, when we started the course, when I first taught the course, we didn't have any books out there, right, that actually address this. So I pulled together a number of my colleagues on this panel have written extensively in these areas, and I pulled together a number of their articles and used them for the first time. Well, the second time around, right, which was last semester in 2021, we actually do have these two books. And one of the books was the Cambridge Handbooks of Psychology and Human Rights, which is co-edited by my colleague Neil Rubin right here on the call and myself. But then the other one is Human Rights Educations by for Psychologists, which is published by Polly Hagenas and others, right? And so again, both of these books became the foundation books for the course. In addition, and I should let you know that in addition to every other article that was out there, and in addition to the human rights instruments that are on the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights, right? So students will be doing both. They'll be reading the psychological foundation, but they'll also be studying human rights issues and norms. Okay. With that, I start off again because of the knowledge base of thinking about, well, what are those four pillars at the United Nations? And we sort of talked about that before. So peace and security is one of them. Human rights, the rule of law, and development. And there really is one is not greater than the other, but because the focus of the course is on human rights, we start there. But by demonstrating that you really can't talk about, and we sort of heard that today, this morning in our first panel, you can't talk about peace and security really unless you're talking about human rights and understanding human rights and how those things work in the context of the rule of law as well as development. So we start there. Then the next, which Felicia just talked about, we also talk about it in the context of this framing from the American Psychological Association which again is going to talk about psychologists possessing human rights, right, as part of their discipline. So they possess them, but they also have to be using them, applying that knowledge and the methods to support the realization of human rights, right? Having a respect for human rights within the practice and within the, and I would argue the practice and the research and the science and the methods that we use, right? So those become really important too. So it's the application of science, but the science has to be grounded, as we talked about before, in this context of human rights. And then, as we're thinking about the advancement of science, right, the advancement of equal access and the benefits of psychological science in practice, right? So the students are going to be grounded in this notion that we need to talk about equal access. And that becomes really critical for a lot of the coursework that gets done. And then advocacy, right? So you have it, but then the final step is advocating for human rights. And how do you go about doing that? This is really a 15 weeks course. We're starting out at the very beginning. You're seeing that students are coming in from very different spaces and places. But by the time they leave, and I can let you know that, so if you might not get to that yet at the end, actually they're very well grounded in both of those areas and they're integrated. And they're sort of walking away feeling that they have agency, if you will. Some of the key course questions that are addressed throughout this course and everything that they touch upon for whatever they're going to do is, so what's the overall issue? What are we starting with? So whether we're talking about climate change or we're going to talk about food insecurity, which is a big issue right now, whether we're talking about mental health crises, whether we're talking about migration or integration, whether we're talking about human trafficking, whatever it is, we have to start with what's the issue, right? And so then what's the human rights issue, right? So there's an overall issue, but then what's the human rights issue? How does this relate to human rights? And then their goal is to describe this not just at the global level, as we just said, because it's easy to talk about an issue happening someplace else that's not part of your own life, but also the local issue. So it's local and it's also global, whatever the issue is. And there's not one that we've talked about that is not both local and global. So we have to ground it, and everything that we talk about is grounded in that way. And then the next question is, well, how do you use psychology, right, to address these issues, right? So we have this human rights issue, and where does psychology come into play? How do we do that? And then what's the human rights mechanism, right? So whether that's the treaty, so whether it's CEDAW, whether it's the Convention on the Rights of the Child, whether it's CERD, Committee on Racism and Discrimination, whatever one it is, the genome, whichever one we're going to choose, we have to go through it and we have to read it so we can understand it. And so they do, right? So they start with those treaties, and then I ground them in a little ways to think really practically. So what are two ways that you're going to walk away with integrating this into the rights and the framework that we've just come about, right? So come up with two concrete ways of doing that. So those are the key questions that frame every issue that we talk about. The learning experiences that they walk away with, and it changes over time, but this time around is sort of looking at media, right? So today was happy we started off with media and looking at the media and how is the media portraying the human rights issue and how are they doing it both locally and globally, right? So again, we think about migration and what does that look like? Well, we might pick out a picture or a story and think about, well, how is it going on globally? And we know that. Well, how is it going on locally? How is it going within the context of this country? How is it going under the context of this state? If we're thinking about it with respect to climate change, right? If you're looking about rivers drying up, or if you're thinking about environmental justice, what does all of that look like? So they start with the media piece. They've also taken a tour of the United Nations, and I happen to be in New York. So for me, this is not necessarily a hard thing to do, except it was hard during COVID. So we couldn't actually go to the United Nations. So they actually did a virtual tour. But the way that that happened was because we're here at Hunter College and we have access to Roosevelt House. The students actually physically got up and we actually did the tour. We sat at Roosevelt House, which is the home of Eleanor and Franklin, and we sat in that house. And again, for some of our students here, that's the first time, right, that they've actually even heard of this connection of Eleanor Roosevelt House to the United Nations that's connected to Hunter College, right? So we sat there and then we did a virtual tour. So somebody from the United Nations actually gave us a virtual tour of the Security Council, of all the councils there, talked about these human rights mechanisms and how they work. And the students actually got to ask them questions about how they worked. And then we came back and debriefed about that, right? So that was one of those learning experiences. And then their final project, when they finished doing this, because this is the front end, is that they work in teams. And those teams are made up of now students who have human rights concentrations as well as psychology majors. And so they've got both in the team. And this time we've chose some contemporary issues so that they could figure it out, didn't tell them what to do. But the broader one was on climate change, right? And again, with those same theme questions and how that's working locally and globally. Children's rights, right? And children's rights included youth, right? So this time around, a lot of the students wanted to work on LGBTQI rights, right? So that's what they chose to do, right? And what does that look like? Refugees and migrants, right? So some chose to do that particular area, and then particularly women and girls' rights. And I can tell you that because of the very things that were happening at the beginning of the semester, as I said, we were in the middle of a pandemic, we were in the middle of war, some of those areas were integrated, right? So we know that we had, for example, women and girls being attacked in virtual spaces and places with respect to rape because of the war and being trafficked, right? So some of those issues actually came up in the context of those learning experiences. So we think about the importance of the framework for the next generation of human rights psychology undergraduate scholars and human rights scholars who are students. There are some opportunities, I think, here. The first one is to learn about human rights, right? So that's where Felicia just talked about, what's the importance of human rights education? Well, writ large, for the broader group of students in general, it's to learn about human rights. Many who have not been exposed to it, many who do not know. So that's the first level. The next is to understand the implications of addressing human rights challenges through the lens of psychological sciences. Again, most human rights programs do not have psychologists, particularly psychological sciences, represented in the program itself. I happen to be part of the human rights faculty, but in general, most programs do not. So again, it's for this body of students is understanding the role of psychological science. The next is to learn to analyze and critique theoretical debates within both the fields of psychology and human rights. And then the implications for shaping policy, right? So that was like the next level. That's the application. How do you go about shaping some of the policy? We may think about, mitigating a lot of the things that are going on through perhaps war, but maybe that's not the best approach. So what are some psychological remedies that we might think about instead in lieu of? Right. And then thinking about finally exploring the intersection of psychology and human rights, again, in a practical way, in their everyday lives, in their communities, and then globally. Okay? And so with that, I will stop there. Thank you.
Well, and thank you, Roseanne, uh, for this glimpse into your teaching in your class. I feel a little bit like I've been in your class now. Um, but I also was particularly struck by your interdisciplinary approach and the way in which you're teaching across disciplines, but not only, how shall I say this, within individual siloed disciplines, but you're creating a reciprocity where the students are learning and sharing with each other across disciplines, which I think is really an important way to use human rights as a foundation for education. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Next, we have Dr. Gabriel Velez, who's an assistant professor and developmental psychologist in the Department of Educational Policy and Leadership in the College of Education at Marquette University. He studies identity development in adolescence, particularly in relationship to civic development, human rights, and peace, including young people's understandings and responses to peace education and restorative practices in their schools. Dr. Velez has been the winner with his dissertation of the 2020 American Psychological Association Committee on International Relations Outstanding Dissertation Award and the 2020 Division 5 Distinguished Dissertation in Qualitative Inquiry Award. He, in his young career, has already had distinguished editorial positions and multiple publications, including his contribution in the Cambridge Handbook of Psychology and Human Rights. He received his BA in History and Literature from Harvard University and an MA and PhD from the University of Chicago in Comparative Human Development, which is the program I graduated from some years prior. And actually this morning we heard from Alex in the first panel, who was at the University of Chicago. So we've got quite a representation this morning of the University of Chicago. In any event, Gabe Velez, you have the virtual floor.
Thank you, Dr. Rubin. And thank you to everyone who's out there, either in person or up on the virtual space with us. I'm going to try and kind of quickly go through what I'm going to talk about today. And I'm happy to do any follow-up, but I do want to make sure we leave a little bit of time for us all to talk at the end, because I think there are a lot of themes across as I'm listening to some of my fellow panelists, and I know I've chatted with them previously about the work they're doing and what they're sharing. So what I wanted to highlight today was just one kind of almost case study and some work that I'm doing that has really been led here at Marquette University by a really forward-thinking group of folks. And I'm kind of just a faculty who get to sort of be along for the ride, but I think it has real connections to these themes we're talking about, and moving beyond kind of the university as a space and thinking of this kind of holistically in relation to human rights education. And so I'm going to sort of start with just kind of a reflection on the role of the teacher scholar, thinking about us as researchers and as educators, and then kind of in this space of human rights education, give a tiny bit of a developmental perspective, and then talk a little bit about this course that I mentioned. So first, as a reflection on the role of the teacher scholar, I have this quote here, which is from the Right to Education in the Teaching Profession. So, I was kind of thinking about this presentation, and I think about myself as a teacher, and I come from a teaching background. Before I went to graduate school, I was a teacher in Harlem, and then in Peru, and then in Colombia. And I think as we think about this space that we are in as educators, if we are in higher education spaces or working as educators in other ways, maybe in mentorship, which I would also include as a sort of a form of teaching, I think it's important to be considering that we are in this space of being socializing agents in relation to human rights and human rights education, but we also have the real opportunity to enact it in who we are, and thinking about it not just as sort of either kind of the banking or the Farrarian, but also as sort of the formative for us, as educators as well. And sometimes that requires us to not just teach it and live it, but sort of push ourselves in ways and sort of be reflective. And I've, had the wonderful chance to be a part of an experience I'm going to share where I felt like I sort of was able to do that. And the other thing is kind of thinking about what the role of education is, right? And in higher education, I think we often think of it in this way that this little Brookings Institute cartoon on the left tends to structure it, right? Where we just kind of study it. I love this idea of an ivory tower, but made out of books. And I think that there are a lot of ways and a lot of spaces in higher education that's being broken down. But I do think that, one of the ways when we think about sometimes our students and educating our students, we're thinking about the tools and things we want them to have, but we're not necessarily thinking about how do they become our students, right? And so I think about that at Marquette. We're a predominantly white institution. We're located in a city that has some of the starkest segregation in the country and a lot of inequities and other issues. And so I can do one thing with my students, but if I'm not thinking beyond the bounds of this institution, then it's all kind of staying internal, and I'm kind of hoping that they're taking it out into space. But if we can step outside of that university up on that hill or on that ivory tower of books and really work with folks and be doing this work together, I think it offers a real synergy with some of the human rights education principles that were laid out, and then some of the developmental ones, both for students that may be within our institution, students who may be outside and in the broader community, and then ourselves as well as educators. So some questions that I kind of think of for reflection of this developmental perspective is, the first is kind of our responsibility to training future scientists. And so this is a space where, I think about this both in terms of content and formation, but also in terms of, like I said, my own sort of openness and growth and what I'm conveying and what I'm socializing. And so, how do I live out the essential core elements of human rights or human rights education in thinking through this? And then the second is about the expanding access. So thinking about that link to kind of the right to science, right? And I think if we think back to the previous slide, the one where we're sitting on the towers of books, the sort of the knowledge and the right to science, or the science kind of building up on itself and staying in the same space. Whereas the one where you're extending outward, right, has this real fluidity, I think, with fulfilling a right to science. And then also thinking questions there, of equity and inclusion as well, both for the students who may come into the space of in higher education institution where a lot of scientists work and a lot of scientists teach, but also, again, like I'm saying, these students kind of out in the community, so to speak. So a couple things then, I'm kind of thinking of some frameworks here for thinking about developmental perspectives. So strengthening the respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, the full development of human personality and a sense of its dignity. I almost do this, I feel like this is like a quiz, right? Because like, where are these coming from, right? These are not my ideas. I want to throw them out there, but I think we're kind of seeing the linkages, and then I'll talk a little bit at the end of this slide. The promotion of understanding, respect, gender equality, and friendship among all nations, indigenous peoples, and racial, national, ethnic, religious, and linguistic groups. Education for human rights, which includes empowering persons to enjoy and exercise their rights and to respect and uphold the rights of others. So now where it comes like the quiz part of like, do you know where this all comes from? So this is from the Plan of Action, the United Nations Decade for Human Rights Education. So this is coming from these documents, right, that are right at this core of thinking of human rights education and training. And I think when I think of some of these things, again, right, just like some of the previous presenters were talking about, these are experiential, right? And I think experiential means that we have to step outside these bounds of the ivory towers of our institutions, and we have to give students the space to process and think and be engaging with material, but also doing this in a way that's engaging with the real world. And the case study that I'm going to sort of give in a second, I think, is not only an opportunity for them to do that sort of in a sense of like maybe like a service learning or in placement or work they're doing, but literally kind of in a way that the class itself is embodying a sense of the right to science and thinking of an inclusive framework for education. And then that, kind of links into as well to the sustainable development goals, and thinking that ensuring that all learners acquire the knowledge and skills to promote sustainable development. So again, thinking about this is, part of that developmental part for our students, part of that breaking down of these sort of barriers and frameworks, and a part of that with this right to science. So the case study I just want to talk about that I mentioned was part of a bigger initiative going on at Marquette is I was able to teach a introductory psychological development course, a focus on adolescents and children. And it's a course I teach every semester. It's part of our core at Marquette. It's part of the class, a required class for our teacher education students. And I taught it last semester at the Milwaukee House of Corrections as part of this educational preparedness program. And so in this course, right, I had students who were incarcerated at the Milwaukee House of Corrections with Marquette students, and we all came into the space there in the House of Corrections together. And once a week, we had 3 hours and we had this course together. And I think on the left, I kind of mapped out a little bit of like some of the educational thinking behind it and the frameworks for this kind of education in prison program, which is kind of beyond the work that I was doing. But I just really wanted to highlight that for me, this is an opportunity as instructor, again, to be thinking about what's my role in enacting and enabling human rights. It's the developmental part for students and students beyond kind of the sort of typical institutional students that we have, meaning the kind of typical Marquette undergrads. But then also thinking about that right to science and that engagement beyond that. And one of the parts for me, again, as an instructor and thinking of this reflectively, was I think that taking this kind of framework of human rights and thinking about a course like this in this way forced me to consider things, the material in a new way, but it also forced me to consider what is my role in this besides, again, just kind of socializing my students within the institutional framework. How can I sort of make this human right to science enacted through the ways that I teach and through the actual instruction and that I do sort of semester in, semester out. And the way I kind of see it, is all connected is there's like the course content, right? And so I was incorporating questions of human rights and human rights education into the actual material. And that's something I regularly do with this class. Thinking about growth and development, both for me as an instructor, but also for my students. Thinking about the experiential part, that was something that was highlighted by the previous presenters, but I think when we're kind of, particularly for the Marquette sort of undergraduates, the sort of typical ones we have, to take them out of that space, for us all to go every week into the House of Corrections and to say, we are going to value this space as an educational space where we all together are going to learn about these topics and we're going to work together and learn from each other. I think that is a really powerful experience. And that was some of the feedback I got from my students. And then the last part is identity based. Both for the Marquette students and thinking about who they are as people in the world and sort of questions of human rights in relation to identity, but also for those incarcerated students. There are a lot of messages that society sends folks who are impacted by our justice system. And I think that that's true in a lot of ways if you're expanding beyond the sort of institution of higher education, because we have this sort of power and privilege and prestige, although there's certainly ways that that has been impacted over the last couple decades. But I think there still is something to say, we are from this university, and we're not only expanding the right to science, but we are in fact going into your spaces. You are a student, you are sort of on par and part of this endeavor that we are trying to engage in all together. And my experience working with these students was that it had a real powerful effect on their identity as well. And that's something that I think can't be sort of discounted in relation to these questions that we've talked about. So just some sort of takeaway or reflections, and that's really what I'm kind of offering here is looking for opportunities to extend our educational mission. So incorporating human rights education not only into the curriculum and training, but sort of more broadly into this ethos of what our education does. Um, the institutional support and programs do matter. So as I mentioned, I'm really fortunate. I didn't have to do the legwork on making this happen. And there's a lot of bureaucracy within these systems when you're talking about the justice system, and there's a lot of bureaucracy and just setup and careful thought that has to go into having these classes. And then also kind of the emotional support as well, and the sort of processing support. And I really do have that right now, Marquette. But I do think those types of programs are building out across the country. There are more opportunities for this. And I think there are ways to see this as a case study engaging with the justice system, but we can think of this in more sort of broader ways. And then tying to these kind of themes that have been mentioned before, but this human rights education as explicit. So it's there in the material of what I'm teaching and in this training as experiential, and not just experiential in the sense of doing sort of explicit human rights work, but breaking down the types of barriers and institutions we have in society that I think are implicitly sending messages that are sort of sometimes counter to the human rights that we all have, for instance, the right to science. And then also reflective. I think these kind of experiences can be really powerful, and they sort of force us to reflect on our own positionality at times, which I think is an important element of this. So I know time is tight and we're maybe a little bit even over, but I hope we have some time to talk, because I'd love to hear questions and share with everyone, um, and see what sort of themes and questions come out across.
Okay, well, thanks, Gabe. In listening to your presentation, um, I'm struck that, in Phyllis and Roseanne's presentations, we're being really informed a lot about human rights education, um, both, around the world and in the classroom. Your presentation strikes me more as a challenge, that you're challenging us to reflect on our positionality. You're challenging us to think about, to reflect on who we are and what we're doing and where we're doing it, and whether the setting is traditional or non-traditional, that these questions of reflection also play an important part in thinking about human rights education. So I appreciate the challenge, and I will work on it. I promise I'll work on it in my own life and in my own teaching. So one of the things I was thinking about as I was listening to each of you is um, how can we persuade uh, human rights education to move from being a kind of niche topic that there can be some talks on, or there can be um, something within programs that don't really bring human rights to the center of education, but rather as a topic that might be touched on, or there might be a lecture on, that kind of thing. And I wonder if any of you have thoughts about bringing human rights education more uh, to have greater centrality in education, whether within academia or outside of academia.
I can start.
Yeah.
So one of the ways, and again, even as I was teaching the course in the undergraduates, because some of their experiences, some of them, by the way, gave similar to not your Marquette students, but maybe closer to your incarcerated students in some ways, right? Because Hunter has like lots of non-traditional students who have family members who have experiences who are not necessarily the same as the traditional student. But I say that because as part of the conversations that have gone on in the classroom, it was sort of like, okay, well, if we here in the US, and I say that in particular, right, have not necessarily ratified lots of treaties, how can we move beyond that? And so students started to have conversations about, well, how can we work in cities? How can we work in our communities? How can we, to sit back to Gabe's part, how can we take what we've learned and use it in our everyday lives as opposed to just keeping it here? So I think that's the opportunity for us. There's a challenge, but it's also an opportunity, which is then to say, let's talk about the application. Let's think about taking it to the level of application and ourselves, but also working with our students and also folks in the communities and giving them that agency to think about human rights. So going back to Gabe's part, right? There are people in the communities and Felicia's that need to learn about human rights and know that they're empowered by those same rights. There are students who are also part of communities that they can go back to sort of speaking about that. There are people, they can also go back to their own family members talking about human rights, right? So we had the whole issue around housing, right? So the human right to housing and access to housing became an issue, right? How do you have that conversation? So I think it's about taking the science and taking those human rights and then thinking about, well, yeah, how do I do that in my everyday lives? And for the students I know that I had, a lot of them were experiencing some of those issues. So they really wanted to know how they could actually do that and be empowered by that. So moving it beyond the classroom and taking it into the community and sharing the science in a way that people would understand it. So that's all. That's what I learned.
I really love your experience, Roseanne, and how you've described you're doing at Hunter College. I have to say, it's just so unique. It's so wonderful. And I also really appreciate the question, Dr. Rubin, about mainstreaming human rights education. It's been a perpetual challenge. Even though I shared statistics earlier on that showed the human rights theme was showing up more, it doesn't speak to how much it's actually being addressed in the classroom. It doesn't speak to the kind of, if you will, pedagogy that both Roseanne and Gabe presented. So the larger question about human rights and mainstreaming it also obviously is intersecting with the local national culture around human rights. It's, you know, we assert here in the United States, those of us who are human rights believers, that it's a non-secular, apolitical framework, political framework, ethical framework. And that's not necessarily widely accepted. I forget the fact that most people don't learn about human rights in schools, although more than they used to. There's been a lot of improvement in the last 20 years. So what I have myself concluded by working with some amazing human rights educators who are working in psychology and social work over the last few years is that I think a discipline-based approach is a good way to go that has potentially the opportunity to supersede local, say, discomfort potentially with the term human rights, because it is seen as political. Even the notion of advocacy, we know some people have problems with. But within the psychology field, for example, what the APA is doing, and social work as well, where human rights, and in the case of social work, combined with social justice is seen as core to the work of social workers in this case, then, you know, it legitimizes, it validates, it mainstreams. Roseanne shared a publication that's come out on the human rights education for psychology. So I'm actually feeling a bit more optimistic about the discipline-based approach potentially being able and working through that lens to introduce human rights education in ways that are meaningful, but also seen as core to a certain kind of thinking or practice. So that's one reaction to this very good question.
And Dr. Rubin, we have 2 questions on the floor, but we were told that you can't see us. So let us know when you're ready for us.
We are ready.
Thank you. I appreciate it. My name is Giza Dang here for Treatment Action Group. And I, first of all, very much appreciated this session and the way you explained the different experiences and bringing all the different strands together. My question would take us to the very beginning. And I wanted to ask Professor Tibbetts if she could talk a little bit about the denomination of psychologists as duty bearers, a term that we usually reserved for states and state actors, and to see if you had some thoughts about that application of the term, in particular because state obligations didn't really factor into your presentation today. Thank you.
Certainly. Thank you for the question. Obviously, you know something about human rights, which is great. So the duty bearer, absolutely, that the original idea about duty bearers and now the term primary duty bearers is used in reference to member states and all those working for them. So that would include not only the decision makers, but also in the case of psychologists that work on behalf of the government or receive funding from the government in some way. So I think that you can make a link between duty bearers in the traditional sense and the work of psychologists that are in some ways benefiting from funding from government sources. But in the last 10 years, especially in the UN, there's been a kind of extension of the treatment of duty bearer language. So now we have recognized, so you've seen, I'm sure you're familiar with it, that private actors, for example, such as businesses, are now seen as secondary duty bearers, or non-governmental organizations that sometimes come into, let's say, context of failed states where governments are not, able to deliver some services, and in a humanitarian emergencies, NGOs are doing as such. These kinds of settings, these kinds of contexts are bringing out this notion that duty bearers, there going to be another category of duty bearers, secondary duty bearers, whose role has a very direct influence on the enjoyment of human rights by others. And I think it's through that lens that I would include all psychologists, not only those who are working on behalf of the government, because the work of psychologists does have a direct bearing on the well-being, the human rights of the clients that they're working with, and in many other ways that psychologists might be actively working to address systemic human rights violations in their own society. So in conclusion, I would just encourage you to look at the recent literature on primary versus secondary duty bearers in the United Nations, and also the role of private actors in the duty bearer context. And thank you for the question.
And the second question from the floor.
Hello. I first wanted to say thank you for these thought-provoking presentations. My name is Allison Dundies-Rentell, and I'm a professor of political science at the University of Southern California, and I'm a member of the coalition. And I just finished a term as chair of the ethics committee for the American Political Science Association. I think it's been very interesting to hear the role of professional associations in promoting human rights, the American Chemical Society earlier, and now the American Psychological Association. I wanted to make 3 brief comments and invite responses. One question I had was about how much emphasis the speakers think we should place on local versus global. I wonder if civil rights are part, if the consideration of civil rights issues is part of the courses on international human rights. Just yesterday, I was at the Legacy Museum, or the day before yesterday, in Montgomery, the new Legacy Museum and Memorial, which was very powerful and quite devastating. And it seemed to me that that sort of field trip, as well as going to the United Nations, could be important. So, and I also wondered, related to that, to what extent, when you speak about experiential learning, you have in mind internships, because USC has a new program called Agents of Change, where they give funding to students so they can have internships in local nonprofit civil rights or human rights or social justice organizations. So I wondered if you would want to comment on your thoughts about what sorts of experiences like that you think are most helpful for consciousness raising. And then finally, my own view is to take more of a multidisciplinary approach to human rights. I've just done a book with Cher Chen at George Mason University, International Human Rights, a survey, which covers a range of topics that are not typically covered in classes, like disability, LGBTQ, indigenous rights, labor rights, and so on. And so I guess I'm just wondering if it's preferable to do a discipline-based approach because it will reach students, they'll see it as more relevant to their career aspirations, or whether or whether, was I mistaken to take a multidisciplinary approach in what I did? Sharon and I are hoping that for people who teach human rights, that maybe at least one of the chapters could supplement things that people are doing. And I teach this, I'm using this book right now in a general education course. And so that's a way of getting students who might not otherwise sign up for a human rights course, but it fulfills a requirement. So I'm getting some, I'm not preaching to the converted. I'm getting some people who are there because it's a GE. And I just want to say Professor Tibbetts is a classmate of mine, and I'm very proud to be her classmate. And it was wonderful to hear her presentation, especially because of that. So thank you.
Okay, I think we had several questions in that question. So I'm going to ask Gabe if he would start us off, and maybe we could have relatively brief comments. Excuse me, because I know everyone's waiting to go to lunch.
Yeah, so just quickly, I want to say that was a wonderful set of questions. I really appreciate that. I just wanted to draw a little bit of a link to what we were talking about before, because I think there are kind of two approaches to that question of interdisciplinarity, which I think is ultimately what you want to have going on. And I know some of my colleagues could speak more to that. But I think when we think of it sort of like practically, there's the way to sort of integrate it into what's already maybe happening and the sort of streamlines that are happening, particularly in programs that exist. So I think of that, when I'm talking about myself as an educator, I can bring it into my classrooms, and I can bring the local that I think students tap in with, but also the international that particularly in the United States, at least, a lot of the students just don't have a sense of when it comes to kind of the human rights. And then there's the kind of the second part, which is the shaping those kind of programs and systems so that it's a part of it more kind of holistically. And there, I think the interdisciplinarity really can come into play too. So we can say, this is another skill, or we can build this into our program. And you mentioned that part at the end, which I think is really critical, because I think when you do that kind of system level, you also can really expand out to those folks who are not already converted. Because when it becomes just something that's like, hey, we're going to have an extra class that I'm offering as an elective, you do end up preaching a little bit to the choir, right, so to speak. And so I think, you can kind of think of it, to me, in those two ways. And so one is very disciplinary focus, where it's like, let's incorporate it into this kind of the pathways we already have. And then the other is, let's kind of try and incorporate it more structurally. And there we can kind of expand across disciplines.
I could just add to that. So I'll add to the last question first, what you asked about possible internships and what have you. So actually, as part of our human rights program here at Hunter, that is a core aspect of it. So I just talked about the course that I teach, but in fact, the students, it's like a capstone for them. They must actually have an internship, right? So they do go out about that. And in terms of whetting the appetite, the whetting of the appetite, I think, is probably more for the psychology major, right? Who may not have thought about human rights and then thinking, oh, I really thought that this was really great. Maybe I'm going to go work with that interdisciplinary group, because in fact, our human rights program is interdisciplinary, right? The students who actually come into it are not majoring in human rights. They're actually majoring in something else, whatever that something else is, but they're a part of the human rights program because they have an interest in understanding about how human rights affects their lives. So I think I appreciate it on all levels. And for myself, as Gabe was talking about earlier, as a faculty person, I appreciate being with my colleagues across disciplines, actually, to have those conversations that I would not normally have just in psychology, right? So I'm with the anthropologists and the biologists and the historians and the political scientists and the lawyers, and we're all having a conversation around human rights through our lens. And so it's also a benefit to me in terms of what I learn in my experience and then what I can share out. So I'll stop there.
I'm just aware of time, so I wasn't sure if I should take any. I guess 30 seconds. I'll just say that although I'm the one that endorsed a discipline-based approach, and I think, and I also agree that in terms of human rights centers at universities, that interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary is absolutely the way to go for all the reasons that Gabe and Roseanne mentioned. So I don't think they're mutually exclusive. There was a time when human rights centers were only in law schools. That was like 30 years ago. And now, at least my observation is that human rights centers, like the one at Columbia University that I'm affiliated with, the Institute for the Study of Human Rights, draws faculty from across the different departments. And it's actually at the capstone, you mentioned that, Roseanne, it's at the capstone senior year where students come together who have been studying anthropology or political science. They come together to work on their theses together, and that's where you get the nice mix of interdisciplinary approaches around human rights. So I absolutely think it's the way to go. But in terms of legitimizing human rights and making sure it's got a really deep roots, and I would still say let's keep it also very discipline specific where we can, but have the centers work at the universities across departments.
Okay, thank you. So two quick things before we close. Both Felissa and Roseanne referred to the 5 connections framework. And I just wanted to give a shout out to Jessica Wyndham, formerly of AAAS, who was very much a part of conceptualizing and writing about that. And then last, in the American Psychological Association's Division of International Psychology, a new award has been established called the Ruben Flores Student Research Award in Psychology and Human Rights. And it will be first awarded next summer, 2023. We invite your students, undergraduate and graduate students. There'll be both an award for undergraduate and graduates, the recognition of the award and a small financial incentive as well. And if you are interested or have students who you would like to have submit their work for this, contact either of us and we will provide the information as it develops. So otherwise, thank you to our panelists. Thank you to those of you gathered in the auditorium and joining us online. And we're very grateful for this opportunity. Have a great afternoon and a great conference.